When it comes to storytelling, writers are normally told to keep their tone consistent, their world manageable, and their story moving, and that all makes complete sense. But then you have One Piece, which seems to set this rulebook completely on fire. It's a terrifying mountain of over 1,000 episodes with cartoon physics, villains who look ridiculous, and a tone that can jump from slapstick to national tragedy within minutes. Not to mention the pacing of the anime. One Piece shouldn't work. But then, reality speaks for itself. Nearly 30 years after it started, One Piece is the best-selling manga series ever and remains one of the biggest stories in popular culture. Big fantasy stories often make one mistake. They ask you to understand the world before giving you anyone to care about. One Piece does the opposite. It begins with one simple desire. Luffy wants to become the Pirate King. That's it. That's the premise that led to a fandom calling it the greatest story ever told. That simple desire carries a whole story containing hundreds of characters, decades of history, and an entire planet of chaos. So how did One Piece turn something that should have collapsed into a masterpiece? On the surface, One Piece is a geographical nightmare. There's islands that possess their own isolated climates and a sea where standard compasses literally break, forcing you to navigate using a special bracelet. And then there's civilizations on the most random places you can think of. You know, like in the sky, underwater, or on a giant elephant. It looks random, but the world follows simple rules, and once you understand them, the madness becomes strangely easy to follow. Take the devil fruits. On paper, it's a lazy, chaotic magic system. Devil fruits can grant almost any ability, from fire to rubber to becoming a giraffe. But every user receives the same weakness. They lose the ability to swim in a world made mostly of ocean. The powers are ridiculous, but the rule is simple. If you fall into the sea, none of the power scaling matters. Generally, you'd expect a character's design to reflect their seriousness. You know, edgy anti-heroes get dark clothes, with the silliest designs being reserved for comic reliefs. But One Piece refuses to let appearance decide how seriously a character should be taken. Chopper is a blue-nosed walking reindeer who looks like a toy designed for children, but his story is about rejection, illness, and losing the person who gave him hope. Similarly, the Going Merry is a boat with a cartoon sheephead. Yet, the series somehow makes people cry when it reaches the end of its journey. In a way, the comedy lowers your guard, so when the story turns serious, it lands harder. And it's a good thing your guard is down, because behind the brightly coloured curtain of One Piece lies one of the most politically dystopian landscapes in modern fiction. What started as a bright pirate adventure gradually revealed a world shaped by erased history, discrimination, and rulers who treat ordinary people as disposable. Which brings us back to the center of the storm, Monkey D. Luffy. His simplicity is what keeps the story clear. Luffy doesn't understand the politics or history behind every conflict. In fact, sometimes he might even outright ignore it. Usually he operates on something much simpler. Did someone hurt his friend? Or is someone standing in the way of freedom? If the answer is yes, he punches them. The world can become as complicated as it likes because Luffy's direction rarely changes. But clear rules and a simple hero don't fully explain why the audience feels so involved. The real trick is how One Piece reveals its world to us. Show, don't tell. It's the first commandment of creative writing. But when your story spans an entire planet across 1,000 chapters, showing everything becomes a logistical nightmare. You'd run out of time and you'd run out of pages. So how does Oda explain a world this big to his audience? He doesn't. At least not in the way you want him to. Instead of show don't tell, he weaponizes a much more volatile and frustrating mechanic. Show before you tell. In a conventional narrative, you're given the context before the conflict. You meet the villain, you learn their evil plan, and then the hero fights them. It's clean and logical. One Piece rejects this, partly because the islands in the Grand Line are geographically isolated. Communication is censored by the state, so as a result, the audience is kept completely in the dark. When the Straw Hats arrive on a new island, Oda routinely drops you into complete confusion. A clear example is Arlong Park. At first, Nami looks like a thief who betrayed the crew. Her village rejects her, she works for Arlong, and nobody explains why. Then the truth arrives. She spent years stealing from pirates to buy her village's freedom, and Arlong never intended to let her succeed. Oda doesn't begin with a lecture about occupation or exploitation. He lets us mistrust Nami first. Then he shows us what the system has done to her. So when she finally asks Luffy for help, the politics no longer feel abstract. They become personal. By the time Luffy finally decides to step into Arlong Park, we're not wondering whether or not he should interfere. We're waiting for him to throw the punch. In other arcs, the scale changes, but One Piece keeps using the same routine. It introduces us to people before institutions. We feel what a broken system has done before receiving the full history behind it. And this works perfectly because while Luffy himself is a pirate, his moral compass is surprisingly pretty clear. Luffy isn't organized, he's completely illiterate when it comes to geopolitics. He even refuses the label of a conventional hero. Why? Because by his own logic, a hero is someone who shares their meat with the village. Luffy doesn't want to share, he wants to eat the meat himself. He can be selfish, reckless, and deeply inconvenient. But when someone's freedom is taken away, his direction becomes completely clear. He doesn't call himself a revolutionary, nor does he have a plan to reform the world government. But all it takes is for the government to tell his crewmate she has no right to exist, and he's willing to declare war on the entire institution. The world of One Piece is full of labels, propaganda, and corruption. If you try to fight the system using its own rules, you lose. But Luffy doesn't care about society's terms. He operates entirely outside its validation. He doesn't need a government to grant him permission to exist. It's not the lore and history that we use to navigate through the world. We do it through the mind of an idiot who demands absolute freedom. And that fantasy of absolute autonomy is no longer confined to the pages of a comic book. In 2025, during massive anti-corruption protests in Indonesia, the Straw Hat Jolly Roger began appearing on banners in the streets. Shortly after, the skull and crossbones with the straw hat were spotted in demonstrations across the Philippines and France. Oda never wrote a chapter telling his audience this cartoon symbol means rebellion. He didn't have to. The symbol became meaningful because millions of people around the world spent decades watching that exact flag arrive wherever people were being starved, silenced, or controlled. By mastering the art of making massive political conflicts feel intensely personal first, Oda created a modern legend. Luffy represents the ultimate human fantasy, the ability to remain completely, unapologetically yourself while a noisy, complicated world constantly tries to dictate who you're allowed to be. At its absolute core, One Piece is a story that believes in a single, radical premise, that ridiculous dreams deserve to be taken seriously. Look at the Straw Hat crew. Their bodies are mutated, their designs are bizarre, their ambitions sound impossible to anyone with a shred of maturity. The world laughs at them, hunts them, and calls them insane, but the narrative itself never does. Oda treats their absurd desires with absolute sanctity, because One Piece is chaotic in everything, except in what it wants you to feel. And in a poetic twist of fate, maybe One Piece treats ridiculous dreams with such respect because the manga itself began as one. Oda's early version struggled to win approval, and even the story's identity had to be rebuilt before publication. He didn't remove the strange ideas. He adapted by giving them an emotional center with the story of Shanks and the Promise. One Piece was never a perfect, immaculate project delivered perfectly from day one. It adapted, it fought, it grew, just like Luffy. And that's how a narrative that seems like it broke almost every rule of literature conquered the planet, turning complete chaos into a masterpiece.